kiddos. So today we are starting a new unit, a new time period, period 4. We're covering 1800 to 1848. Today we'll just be going over from 1800 to 1814. So we'll start with Jefferson's inauguration or his election and go through the War of 1812. So 1800 is an important turning point in American history because you have the first transfer of power from one political party to another. In current times, in more recent history, there's never really been a question if a president loses re-election, it's never really been a question of whether or not they will step down afterwards. And that's because of the precedent that John Adams set in 1801. He loses re-election to his sitting vice president, Thomas Jefferson, someone that has very different ideological views on government. So you have this new establishment of political parties in the last few years of really Adams' administration. It was something that Washington had warned the country about, right? He had said that, I'm starting to see these factions that are becoming, more divisive. It worried him about his country. I mean, even today, that's something that that worries a lot of people, is the divisiveness and this division within our country around the view of government and the role of political parties. And today we have technology and media that also plays a role in that. That's something that also played a role when looking at newspapers of the day. They were very partisan biased newspapers, so that's not really new. But this idea of where you get your information and how much of it is true and misinformation, I think Washington would be like, yeah, I told you guys. So when Adams loses re-election, it was very hard for him. He was a very proud man, and especially to Jefferson, since they had been friends during the Revolutionary period. They kind of fell apart during Washington's administration. But the good news is that they will become friends again later. They have a really interesting friendship, even though they fall out during these years. Basically, after the War of 1812 ends, Washington and Adams start to write letters to each other once again. So Adams never leaves Quincy, Massachusetts after he leaves Washington, D.C. that day, that March day in 1801. He kind of leaves through the back door the night before Jefferson's inauguration. He goes to Quincy, Massachusetts, and that's where he'll live until 1826. And but he'll start writing letters. They'll be writing letters from Monticello to Quincy, Massachusetts, back and forth for about 10 years. And they reflected a lot on what they did during the Revolution. They reflected on their friendship. They reflected on the state of the country, and we'll look at some of those letters when we get to the era of good feelings. And what's really interesting about these two men is they were the last remaining signers of the Declaration of Independence, and it was coming up on the 50th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence. So the last two signed. They actually sat on the committee that wrote it, and they were having this big celebration in Philadelphia. And they were too old to go. They were, so it's coming up on July 4th of that year. And both men passed away that same day. So they both passed away on July 4th, 1826, on the 50th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence. And it's always kind of those eerie things that happen. But it was during this time really difficult for Adams to step away, but he did it. And that's an important precedent. And every president since then, if they lost re-election, they walked away on Inauguration Day. They accepted the new party openly and willingly, and that's a very, very important thing to know and understand. So Jefferson in 1800, again, the country had majorly shifted from this Federalist view, we call the Federalist era, of big government and Hamilton's economic plan and a larger military. Adams, unfortunately, I think deserves a lot more credit than he's probably given in history. He wasn't very popular, which is why he lost re-election. And it was really kind of a sign of the times. And so there was this overwhelming view that the Democratic Republicans, or sometimes you will see them listed as the Republicans. Jefferson called himself a Republican. The reason that we as historians refer to them as Democratic Republicans is so that students don't get confused with the Jeffersonian Republicans, to be Republicans of Abraham Lincoln, and even the Republicans of like Ronald Reagan's Republican Party. And it's even kind of interesting today when looking at like Trump's Republican Party. There's a very big difference between them. Parties evolve; they're ever changing. They evolve with the times. They adjust. They pick up new policies. They drop policies, or even like ideology on certain issues. And so they're constantly changing. And so in order to not confuse kids, sometimes you will see them called as the Democratic Republicans, which really in this early 19th century lens, okay? So in his inaugural address, he says, we are all Republicans, we're all Federalists, right? He's trying to unite the country. Didn't really like lead his administration that way. He did take out all of Adams' cabinet and put in all Republicans. He definitely wanted to hear from people that were like-minded as him. So where Washington put people in his cabinet where he would get different views and different perspectives. And that's one of the great things about Washington and his cabinet. It's one of the things that Abraham Lincoln did, is he put people that disagreed with him on his cabinet and disagreed with one another so that he could hear kind of both sides and really make sure that he was representing all Americans. Jefferson, not so much. Now, he did keep certain Federalist policies. He realized later on the National Bank was a really good idea. Hamilton's financial plan and the debt payment, that was a good idea. He did repeal some of those excise taxes. He lowered the national debt, reduced the size of the military. He kind of cut spending where he could because he was a conservative in that way. He did not believe in a large centralized government when it wasn't necessarily needed. Now, the downside of that is the military, especially like the Navy, is going to need to be used in regards to impressments and the British and the French and other nations challenging our neutrality. He did follow that proclamation of neutrality, that precedent that Washington set as well. And that's going to be his biggest issue, especially like foreign policy wise, during his 2 terms that he served. So his first major act as president, and one of the most important things, especially looking at domestic policy, was the Louisiana Purchase. Now, Thomas Jefferson is one big walking contradiction. He said that he was a man of the people, and that, when we were talking about in the last unit, how he believed in like an agrarian future and the small farmer. I mean, he really did believe that, but keep in mind that he was a wealthy planter. He owned slaves. In the Declaration of Independence, he talked about all men are created equal. Originally, he even attempted to do away with slavery in the Declaration, but it was kind of, that's not what they wanted to do because they needed Southern votes. Yet he owned hundreds of slaves. And he also had children with one of his slaves. And he freed some of them after he passed away. But again, like common man, but yet he had the most expensive taste and died in debt. He's just very complex and a big contradiction. The same thing with the Louisiana Purchase. He believed in strict interpretation of the Constitution. And nowhere in the Constitution does it give the president the executive power under Article 2, the power to purchase land from a foreign government. And so he interpreted it broadly because he realized that this deal was too good to pass up. And it also played into his agrarian views because his whole thought was, well, this country needs to be, the future is going to be in farming and people moving west, and kind of an early example of like manifest destiny. Like we need to move west and we need to grow. And this opportunity is in line with that. It works really well with this idea that we need land for people to expand to in the future. Now, he had no idea that Louisiana, that this territory of like modern day like Missouri and Kansas and all of that would be settled, in the coming generations. He's thinking that this is something that's going to take, 100+ years to settle. But that's how quickly the American progress has kind of decided to move. So the opportunity presents itself. Napoleon's really struggling financially. He originally approaches Napoleon about access to New Orleans and for trade for those farmers along the Mississippi River. But Napoleon's like, well, actually, how about like all this land? And he's like, ooh, okay, sounds good to me. $15 million, it's something like 2 cents an acre. So even by today's standards, it's like the deal of the century. But it was a constitutional predicament. It was something that he was criticized for, just mostly on principle. He decided to interpret the Constitution in a way with, it had something in the Constitution about like what to do with the land, even though it didn't say specifically that he could purchase land. And so he just kind of, and he knew it. He knew that he stretched it to the point he had even said of like he almost broke it. It was a good decision. And so what we learned from that is, kind of like, I think of like with political parties, like putting country over party, right? In this particular position, he knew that this was the best decision for our country, especially in his views, like in the future. And it would be interesting to see. So it doubled the U.S. landmass. And then it also is going to play a large role in what's going to happen with the Mexican-American War and obtaining more land in the 1840s. So it probably was a good decision on his part, but it was an interesting one that he had to kind of defend. So again, Jefferson is a very interesting man. He was an inventor. You would call him a Renaissance man, if you will. He was interested in science and art and archaeology and engineering, all of it. And he wanted to know what lies in that territory. And so he enlisted Captain Meriwether Lewis, who is an old friend, and William Clark to lead this expedition of discovery where they would travel across the Louisiana territory for scientific purposes, so like new species of plants and animals, as well as like for map making. So Lewis was kind of the scientific mind, and he cataloged and drew pictures and took samples of new species of plants and drew sketches of animals that they'd come across, like the prairie dog, for example. They saw the buffalo and grizzly bears and things like that they hadn't really seen back east before. And William Clark was the cartographer, so he did all of the map making. Now with them, they could not have accomplished this without the accomplishment of, you might know her as Sacagawea or Sacagawea. She was a Shoshone Native American woman that had been sold to a French fur tradesman as his wife. So she was a teenage girl. She had a baby with her, and basically the French fur tradesman was like, yeah, you can have her, right? So they purchased her, I guess, or purchased her services because she spoke Shoshone, and they knew that they would need Shoshone or at least Native American help once they got into the interior along the rivers. And so it also helped, though, because she's a woman. So you don't have this war party, this group of men with guns. Instead, you now have a woman who's a Native American that can kind of help with the communication part. And she was crucial to that. She had her baby with her. She saved. There were different times where like canoes had turned over in the water, and she like jumped in the water with the baby on her back and like saved some of Clark's maps and Lewis's like diaries and journals. And she played a really, really important role. Another person that played a really important role on this is York. So York was William Clark's slave that went with him. So he was a Black man that participated. And he, it's interesting, when they actually got to Oregon, so they went past where the actual boundaries were of the country, of what the United States had purchased. They went all the way to the Pacific coast. And when they got there, they basically had to make this decision where they could set up camp for the winter, or they could try to make their way back home before winter really set in. And on the shores of Oregon, they basically voted very similar to like something you would see with the Mayflower Compact. Like it was democratic, everyone gets a vote. And it's the first recorded time that we have in American history, first recorded, right, where a woman and a Black man had equal vote as white men on an issue. And I think that that's important to know and pay attention to. So some other issues going on domestically at home is going to be with the judiciary. So even though the Republicans or the Democratic Republicans have made progress within Congress and in the White House, Federalists still are in control of the judiciary, so of the federal courts and the Supreme Court, right? Because Washington and Adams were the ones that were appointing these new justices. Now, John Marshall, by this point, is now Supreme Court Chief Justice. He will serve for 34 years, okay? So we call his court the Marshall Court. And by far, the Marshall Court played the largest role in establishing precedent for the role of the judicial branch. And really that lies with the Marbury versus Madison court case. Now, John Marshall and Thomas Jefferson did not get along at all whatsoever. They had very different views. And John Marshall, if you really think about it, probably did more in like grabbing power away from the Constitution, or like giving the judicial branch more power than it had ever really been designed within the Constitution. And when we think of today with issues of president and the Senate and kind of having control there and nominating Supreme Court justices, the reason that you have why people care about the Supreme Court and why it's a political thing is because of Marbury versus Madison, because of what John Marshall did. John Marshall made the Supreme Court kind of a political thing. He took the power that the Constitution and Article 3 gave him in interpreting the Constitution, and he interpreted it in a way that really does give more power to the Supreme Court than any other branch. And there is the ability for them to abuse power if you get the wrong combination of justices on the court to where they have that absolute power. Because basically what judicial review establishes is that the Supreme Court gets to decide what is constitutional and what's not. So it can be an act of the president, it can be an act of Congress, of the states, and they get to decide. They have the power to do that. And if it gets politically leaning too far in one direction and they want to use that power, they technically can. Hopefully they don't, but there is the ability to do that. And that's why you have like really like liberal parts of history where the Supreme Court basically like allows for lots of different things to happen and interprets it in a very like broad scope. And it does change, like, especially when we look at civil rights. If it weren't for the Supreme Court, you know, the discrimination would have continued in these southern states. So, you know, Brown versus Board of Education was a really important Supreme Court case. When you look at the rights of people and criminality, if you look at the scope of the 14th Amendment, in the 20th century, they played a really important role in making sure that people are treated equally. And so we'll see in the future, you know, the court is kind of shifting to this more conservative political leaning. But remember, the job of the Supreme Court justices, they take an oath not to party. They technically don't have political views or belief or alignment with political parties. Their number one job is, what does the Constitution say about this issue, and interpret that. And that takes years and years of studying the law and studying constitutional issues and the Federalist Papers and things like that to interpret that. So for judicial impeachments, Republicans had hoped to remove some partisan judges so you can be impeached. And so that has to do with like Adams's midnight judges, right? So he creates all these different positions. Because again, Adams was upset that he lost. So he created new federal court positions and stacked them with Federalists. That's kind of thinking his like long lasting legacy. And mostly it was kind of a failure, right? So judges are going to be more cautious after this. They're going to be less partisan, which is the good news, because they are worried about that impeachment part. So the election of 1804, Federalists weren't the problem in Jefferson running for re-election. He was pretty popular at that point. Instead, it came from a guy by the name of Aaron Burr. If you are familiar with the musical, you know that Burr and Hamilton had a lot of issues. Burr and Jefferson are going to as well. So basically in 1800, what the Electoral College, because there's no popular vote at this point in time, the Electoral College is trying to decide, like they want Jefferson to be president, but what they don't want is kind of the situation that happened in the past where two different men of ideological differences like Adams and Jefferson are like president and vice president, right? So in 1800, they don't want Adams to be vice president because he's running. So within the Constitution, technically, if Jefferson wins, Adams, the former president, is now the vice president. They didn't want that. They wanted Burr to be the vice president. But one elector messed everything up and accidentally voted for Burr so that it ended up being a tie, okay? So then it goes to the House of Representatives. This is the first, now eventually they'll fix this with the 12th Amendment to where the president, the vice president run together. And that's, we still have that same, we still use that today. And so that will apply in 1804. But this does start off, like not start the feud between Burr and Hamilton. They had been kind of, not getting along for years now. But basically Burr has this animosity towards Hamilton to where he believes that every time he is about to make something of himself, because Hamilton, like they kind of like rose through the ranks together, like both orphans, both in the Revolutionary War. They were friends early on, but then Hamilton with Washington and, Secretary of Treasury, like he started to become more successful while Burr just really struggled. So once Burr realizes that Hamilton did play a role, he gave his opinion. He hated Jefferson, but he also hated Burr. Like he's like, at least Jefferson has a political ideology and at least he has views, where Burr basically didn't have political views. At one point he was backed by two different parties because he was an opportunist. He was just looking to like make his way up versus actually having a strong ideology. And so he went with Jefferson. Hamilton's like, no, like Jefferson should obviously be president. And that upset Burr. It also is going to upset Burr when he tries to run for governor in 1804 of New York. Hamilton is a famous New Yorker. Hamilton writes these letters basically criticizing Burr, and Burr loses big. And so once again, now Burr is upset with Hamilton. So he challenges him to a duel. The Federalist conspiracy was basically when he was running for governor of New York, his whole idea was, hey, I want to join New York with New England. And there was talk of seceding from the Union. Nothing ever really like went with that because it kind of fell away when he lost the election for governor in 1804. So he challenges Burr to a duel. And dueling is really important. And if you, it's a really important part of culture at this point in time. And so I want you to think of a duel as if you are insulted in some way. Your honor and your being called a gentleman was extremely important. And so, or even if like a friend was called out and you didn't like defend that friend, that's a question of your honor. And there are examples of that we can kind of draw to today, where you would confront someone if they've done you wrong in some sort of way. Like I always think of like the cafeteria fight, right? Where kids, you talked about my girlfriend, or you talked about my friend, and like, so let's fight. It seems a little silly, right? Dueling was a whole nother level. But the thing about dueling was it wasn't normally something that would, the purpose of it was not to kill people. Okay, let's just get that. It was more about showing up with your gun. That makes you a man. In most duels, the men would show up. So you would challenge because you're protecting your honor. And then that person would show up and then you're protecting your honor. And typically what happens is it's solved right there. There's not even a shooting. If they did want to take it one step further, like it was a really heated or like they really don't dislike each other, most of the time what would happen is they would fire in the air. And in this case, and this is what Lin-Manuel Miranda in the Hamilton musical kind of did with like throwing away your shot. Like, so that was one of the songs about how he's not going to throw away his shot. And then it kind of like carries on to the duel, to where because Burr challenged Hamilton, Hamilton gets the first shot. And we don't exactly know what happened because the witnesses that were there, dueling is illegal. They go to New Jersey. New Jersey is less likely to, I guess, charge people with duel. Like, you know what I mean? It's kind of one of those things like that's where you went to do illegal things. And so their friends, the witnesses that were there, they basically turned around so that they couldn't be held, like participating in this illegal event. So we don't know exactly what happened. Hamilton's second, so a second is the person that comes with you to kind of help mediate, says that Hamilton shot his gun in the air, right? To say like, all right, you're a man, I'm a man, here we go, let's get this over with. And then Burr shot Hamilton and killed him. And Burr was thinking that, yeah, got him. Like he's thinking that he'll be kind of celebrated because Hamilton there's some controversy with adultery and things like that at this point. But that was not the case. So he had to flee. And by the way, he's the sitting vice president at this point in time. Okay. Like it hasn't turned over yet. So he flees to the South. Eventually, he got a friend to kind of like drop the charges, but again, he like murdered Alexander Hamilton. And then he comes back, he finishes out his term as vice president. Then he goes to Mexico and tries to like incite a rebellion there and unite with Louisiana. Like the man was a basket case. He eventually has to flee to Europe. Eventually, because John Marshall hated Thomas Jefferson, Jefferson brought up charges against him, but he had fled to Europe. John Marshall kind of basically looked over the trial and said, no, he's fine, and acquitted him. And Aaron Burr died in poverty in upstate New York, but it's a really, really interesting story. And that's why like it's part of the Hamilton musical. But he was kind of crazy, and he was vice president. So he was just that close to being president one day. All right, foreign policy, basically impressments and testing American neutrality is going to dominate not only Jefferson's foreign policy, but his successor in Madison and even Monroe. So the Barbary Wars a lot of the merchant ships were being attacked. So not British in France, but like Tripoli, off the north coast of Africa. Before Adams and Washington had kind of like paid them a bribe, that really upset Jefferson, like new guy in town. And he's like, no, we're not going to do that. So we do fight these Barbary Wars for a few years. It earns some respect from the American Navy. They get a little bit of experience under their belt. Britain will continue to seize American merchant ships, take the cargo, but then also take the sailors and impress them into the British Navy. One of the problems that the British Navy had is that when they were coming into port somewhere in the Caribbean islands or even into like the United States, is that their members of the Navy would flee, right? They would desert, and then they would join up on a merchant ship to kind of become lost, right? And get away from the Navy and then hopefully become an American citizen, because there was more opportunity there. And so they knew that was happening, but instead of just taking people that they thought were British, they were taking anybody that were on these ships. The Chesapeake Leopard affair increased a lot of anti-British sentiment, so that's going to kind of lead up to like one of these reasons why Jefferson's going to issue the Embargo Act, and then eventually the War of 1812 as well, okay? So Jefferson, like Washington and like Adams, he is trying to avoid war with Britain. They're not strong enough. They don't have the money to do it. It would be too expensive. So that's his conservative side. So instead, he persuades the Democratic Republicans to pass an Embargo Act. And basically, like, you can't trade with anybody. Okay, no foreign ports. And what he was thinking was, Britain's factories depend on our natural resources. And I think he's thinking with France to a certain extent as well. And his thought was, if we deny them those natural resources, if we deny them the tobacco or the rice, like the timber, like all of these things, if we deny them those things, it will starve out their factories and it will send them into an economic recession. They will have to listen to us. They will have to play by the rules and acknowledge our neutrality. Unfortunately, it backfired on in every single way. It hurt farmers, but primarily it hurt the merchants of New England. A deep, deep recession. It was so bad that before he leaves office in 1809, he's going to encourage them to repeal it. They'll have the Non-Intercourse Act. The Non-Intercourse Act even still said, like, okay, we're going to trade, but we're not going to trade with Britain and France. But really, the damage had been done. And so the Embargo Act was one of those examples of that's actually going to play a role as well, where Americans are going to have to start to adopt their own type of industry and their own type of factories. And we'll get to that with the War of 1812. So Jefferson's legacy is really interesting. He leaves office kind of in not very popular. He's lucky that Madison was able to even win election in 1808. But a lot of Federalists were elected back into Congress that year because of Jefferson and his policies. When you look at Jefferson as a whole, like between the Declaration and between the end of his presidency, it's interesting that he retired back to Monticello in Charlottesville, Virginia, where he had created the first public university. Because again, his whole view was to help the common people and help the farmers. And like, he believed in democracy. And in order to have a nation, a democratic nation, he knew that he needed an educated electorate. And education was very important to him. And that's why he helped founded the University of Virginia. Again, it's not a Harvard, it's not a Yale, it's not a Columbia, it's Virginia, the common people. And when he died, he knew that on his gravestone, what he outlined what he wanted his gravestone to look like. And it's very interesting, as you can see here, that he talks about how the author of Declaration of Independence, of the Statute of Virginia, because he served on the Virginia General Assembly for years, and talked about religious freedom, father of the University of Virginia. What's missing? He was vice president. He was president of the United States. That was not something that he was ever really proud of. I think he hated the presidency. He was not a very good politician. He was more of an intellectual. And he also didn't really like being criticized either. And so I think it's interesting. So even though he has held this position that in our country, we think that we value like being president is the greatest thing in the world. But in his view, it really wasn't. And in the eyes of people that saw the Constitutional Convention and saw what the intention of was for the presidency, it really wasn't that important. To him, the legislature is more important, and belonging to the people and education and religious freedom. Like, it's more about the people. And I think that that's something that we should look into, is that these founding fathers didn't view the presidency as all that important. But what have we done over the course of time is the views have changed of the people of who the president is and their importance. I think it's important to know that no matter who is ever elected president, that person's not going to make your life really all that much better or worse. Like, you're kind of more in control of that yourself, and it's more about your community and your local government and your state government. That's going to have a far greater impact on your day-to-day life than the presidency. But for some reason, we have allowed for it to kind of dominate, our feelings, and it's created a lot of division as well. The other thing about Jefferson is, we know that he had 7 children with Sally Hemings. Sally Hemings was a slave that he owned. We don't know what type of relationship, how we would classify this relationship. We know that he freed those 7 slaves, and those 7 slaves only, when he passed away. The rest were inherited to his white daughter's husbands. Sally Hemings was not freed. Instead, she was passed on to his oldest daughter, and it was very like written in detail as to where her home was supposed to be, and the things that her monthly, like, because she didn't have to work at that point, she just had her home because she was older. And so he kind of took care of her, I guess, in the will. It also made a little bit more sense because, as an older Black woman living free in Virginia in the 1820s, it was actually illegal for you to do. You would have to move to a different state. And so she was kind of more taken care of under the care. I hate saying that, but in his view, at that point in time in history, the times that we're talking about, she was more taken care of legally if she belonged to his daughter's family. As for those 7 children, half of them passed as white. So they went on to marry white spouses and have white lives and be educated and own property and things like that. The other half were free Blacks. And so they moved throughout the country into the North and carried on, married Black spouses, and lived as free Blacks for generations. So this image is a man that is the 9th generation of great grandson of Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings. And there was just recently an article that he wrote really on like Jefferson's legacy with monuments and slavery and this big walking contradiction. And we'll talk about that in class a little bit. Okay, so after Jefferson leaves office, James Madison, the father of the Constitution, wins the election. But remember that Federalists did kind of make their way back into Congress by this point because Jefferson wasn't all that popular towards the end. Madison's presidency was plagued by many of the same issues for Jefferson. It's almost like a continuation. The economic hardships continued even after the Non-Intercourse Act, even with Macon's Bill number 2. So that introduced back, they're like, okay, well, so we're not going to trade with other countries, but what if we trade with other countries, but still no Britain and France, like out of principle? And then it also even attempted to, what Madison did is he said, hey, Britain or France, if you promise us that you won't attack our ships, we will promise to not trade with the other side, because they're still going back and forth with each other, Britain and France. So Napoleon was like, okay, I'll bite on that. We promise not to attack your ships. And so Madison invoked it and said, all right, we're not trading with Britain now. We'll only trade with France. And eventually, they realized that Napoleon was just being Napoleon, and he did not honor that. And so it was kind of this big disaster. Okay, so Madison is mostly known for the War of 1812, and his wife Dolly also played a really important role. In 2018, I was selected to attend the White House Historical Society's Teacher Institute, and I learned a lot about Madison and Dolly Madison and the role that she played in the War of 1812. So I'll talk about that here in a second. So causes of the War of 1812. One is Britain refusing to honor U.S. neutrality. So they're continuing to attack British or American merchant ships and impress those sailors and those merchants into the U.S. Navy. That's what an impressment is. The other thing that's going on is in the Northwest Territories. So think of Ohio, Indiana today. There's been a lot of tension between settlers moving out into that area and Native American tribes. Native American tribes have kind of created this confederacy and kind of united with the help or under Native American chief Tecumseh. He tried to unite all of the tribes east of the Mississippi to kind of fight English, or not English anymore, American settlers moving into that territory. And again, this is a continuity. We've had issues with Native Americans over land since 1607, if not earlier than that. And so Tecumseh and his confederacy had defeated American militia in that area time and time again. At the third skirmish, we actually had like the United States military come in. And so at the Battle of Tippecanoe, they realized that Tecumseh and his men and this confederacy of tribes, it's not just them fighting the United States, but they have been aided by the British. They have new British weapons and British supplies and ammunition. And so basically what they've realized is that the British in Canada, which is not that far, right, away from that area, have been supplying Tecumseh kind of like as an ally in order to create this division or this nuisance for the American government in the Northwest Territory. Now, by this point, so we are in 1812. The Revolutionary period is over. Washington has passed away by this point. Basically, a lot of people that are adults now, a lot of these men that are going to be considered war hawks, they were born around the time of the Revolution. They were born in the 1770s or the 1760s. And so they grew up with their fathers going and fighting this war for independence and being patriots. And so now they're adults. And it's almost as if they are kind of looking for their shot now at defending American honor and kind of their patriotic duty. There's been a lot of criticism, especially with like Washington and Adams and even a little bit with Jefferson, that they haven't done enough to bend the honor against Britain as they've been attacking them for these decades now. Where Washington and Adams and Jefferson were trying to avoid war because they worried about if they go to war with Britain again, like they kind of got lucky the first time, right? They don't want to undo all the work that they've done. Well, now their sons are here and their sons are in charge. And a lot of them are war hawks like Henry Clay and John C. Calhoun. They're typically from the West. They're typically from the South. They're kind of like rough and tumble, if you will. They all come from privilege. There's no doubt about that. But they're just this new generation of Americans, and they want to do their part, and they want to play a role in defending American honor. And they basically persuade Congress and Madison to declare war. And that declaration of war comes in June of 1812. Not the best idea, but thankfully we lucked out again. The country's divided. Neither Congress nor the American people were really united in any of this. It was a regional divide, so southern and western states, kind of like rural areas, viewed one way, so kind of think of the war hawks, and like northern states in New England were like, oh, this is a really bad idea. Really, it has a lot to do with the fact that they were the ones that, so it's kind of flipped from the American Revolution. They are worried about their economy, and and a lot of the trade is done with Britain, like we've talked about in the past. Like, in the 1790s, 80% of trade was done with Britain, and then you have the Embargo Act and all this. So they're really struggling financially. And so it did create a lot of division among the states. Now in 1812, Madison wins re-election, and DeWitt Clinton basically had a really hard time kind of uniting. You had some Federalists, you had some anti-war Republicans or Democratic Republicans, but there's a lot of opposition to Mr. Madison's war. The most outspoken were New England merchants, Federalist politicians. You had Quids, who were like the old Republicans, so kind of like the Jeffersonian view, right? So Jefferson never wanted to really go to war with Britain, where they believed in a limited federal power. Like, let's just let my farmers be farmers and let's just be happy and try to do the best we can. And so regardless, war occurs. Now, we don't need to know a ton of detail when it comes to the war itself. Basically, you had most of it's done in the Navy and like even in the Great Lakes. The U.S. was overwhelmed by Britain's naval power, very similar to the Revolution. But Madison was hoping to win based on the fact that Napoleon was continuing to kind of become an issue for Britain in Europe. And so he's hoping that Napoleon will continue that war to where British forces are kind of split between the two continents. And they're hoping to basically take Canada. It would be interesting today, like if they were successful there, that Canada would be all of the United States. It's kind of an interesting thing to think about. And it could have happened. The invasion of Canada did not go very well. They lost multiple battles. They did raid York, so like Toronto at the time, what we call Toronto now, and they burned York. And so that is why the British retaliated and burned Washington, D.C. eventually once they get a little bit more men and more power over after Napoleon's defeated. So the Navy, though, did fairly well. The shipbuilding was really good. That goes back to that colonial history of, the seamen and the fishermen and the shipbuilding. We kind of have that history. In 1812, the USS Constitution, it was called Old Ironsides. It was a big, American morale defeat of the British because they sank a British ship off the coast of Nova Scotia. Profiteering was basically where you would, it's kind of like piracy basically. So, or they would try to make money off of the captured British ship. So that's what they were doing there. Motivated by patriotism, they deserve it. So you can kind of think of looting or whatever you want, taking of property. The British Navy was very successful in blockading the U.S. coast. That did cripple trade, especially in New England. The Battle of Lake Erie is again kind of a good turning point, where Captain Oliver defeated the British, and then William Henry Harrison, he will eventually become president because of his kind of war hero status, was victorious over Tecumseh at the Battle of Thames in the Northwest Territory. So he kills Tecumseh, and then so they're starting to kind of make some ground. Eventually, the U.S. will kind of have a difficulty because the British so Napoleon will be defeated, and the British are able to dedicate more troops over here. And so the Chesapeake campaign, that's where they burn Washington, D.C. That is where Dolly Madison famously takes the portrait. It's a Gilbert Stuart painting. It's the one where Washington's holding his hand out like this. Where so the story that I had always heard was that she rips it off the wall because she's basically told it's time to leave. Madison is out on the front lines trying to defend Washington. That's something interesting, right? Because the commander-in-chief, so they're at war. So Madison, President of the United States, is out on the front lines with guns and cannons and all that. It's not something we do anymore. And Dolly gets word that it's time to evacuate DC. And so the story was that she yanks it off the wall, she cuts the painting out of the frame, rolls it up, sticks it under her dress, and flees, right? And she saved this painting. That is not what happened at all whatsoever. I mean, it's kind of a cool story, but when I was in DC and I was in the White House, I had the ability to really cool, behind the scenes, able to just walk throughout the White House. It was really cool. No, I did not see the president, but I did see that Gilbert Stuart painting of Washington hanging in the presidential dining room, their private dining room. And y'all, the painting is as big as, it's huge. There's no way that this little woman who is barely 5'2" could take this painting, this huge frame and everything. Obviously the frame's been changed out by now, but it would still need a huge frame. The painting itself is taller than she was. The width of it is even probably easily half, more than half her body length. And so there's no way that that woman could have done it. So apparently what had happened is she had actually told some of the slaves in the home, in the White House, she flees and she's like, by the way, I want that painting. And so they actually took the painting and saved it. And I learned a lot about that particular man. He actually ended up financially supporting Dolly Madison for most of her life because Madison dies and she was a young woman still. And so she lived for another 40 years without him, and she struggled financially. And it was that enslaved man that eventually she did give him his freedom, and he worked in Washington, D.C. and was actually he wrote a book, and money from that he actually gave to Dolly Madison and supported her until she died. It's a great story. I'll make sure we talk about it in class. The most important thing from the battles of the War of 1812 is going to be the Battle of Fort McHenry. That's in Baltimore. That was immortalized by Francis Scott Key's Star Spangled Banner. If you've ever in class, we will listen to the song, and hopefully you've realized by now when you sing the words that the song is talking about victory, right? The night, and there's bombs bursting, and there it was. Morning comes, and the flag is still there, which means that they defeated the British. And it's obviously an important song in our country, and it's kind of one of those things, like kind of goosebumps if you kind of realize like what it means and what it symbolizes. So after that, Britain's kind of over it, and they start negotiating a peace treaty. So the Treaty of Ghent basically establishes status quo antebellum. So let's restore everything before the war. So status quo means like as is. Antebellum means before war, and that's Latin. However, as the treaty has been negotiated and signed in Europe, we don't know what's going on back at home. And so Andrew Jackson's still like fighting the British, and he defeats the British at the Battle of New Orleans. It's interesting because Jackson gets this like fame because they've signed the Treaty of Ghent. Jackson wins the Battle of New Orleans. No one knows about the treaty yet. So New Orleans hits the papers, right? And they're like, oh, Andrew Jackson, and yeah, America, woohoo. And then word gets back about the Treaty of Ghent. And so Americans put 2 and 2 together, and they believe that Andrew Jackson won the war. Now, it was an important battle, and it was a good battle, but didn't win the war. The war was already over. At the same time, the Hartford Convention is also going on, where radical New England Federalists, not all Federalists, but they had basically decided to secede from the Union. They were like, no, we don't want nothing to do with these crazy war hawks. We want nothing to do with the Democratic Republicans and Madison. We want a country that takes our interests into account, and we, the minority, these New England merchants, are not being considered in our government, and we want to secede from the Union. It's treason. And so they're thought of that, because at the same time as they're doing that, a treaty is being signed and the war is over, and they were seen as unpatriotic. They were seen as traitors. And so what it does is it actually weakens the Federalist Party to a point where the Federalist Party is not going to be around after this. You might have some individuals that consider themselves Federalists, but not really on a national level. Okay. So what are the effects of the war? U.S. does gain a little bit of respect. This is a second Revolutionary War. It's like, yeah, we needed help from the French the first time, but we beat Britain not once, but twice. I don't know if they really beat them. It's just kind of like they like poked the bear, and then they got lucky when they escaped without harm, even though they were harmed because the Capitol was burned to the ground. Federalist Party is on a sharp decline after this. This is the early talk of the idea of nullification from the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions, like a federal law, the states trying to nullify it, and states' rights and secession. We're going to see that again throughout the 1800s towards the Civil War. Native Americans are forced to surrender more land to U.S. settlement. Big thing here, and we'll talk about this with the Era of Good Feelings in the next chapter, is new factories, industrial self-sufficiency. Between the embargo and the war itself, the United States can't purchase finished goods from Britain anymore. And so they realize like we need to make our own factories. And so it's very, very important in economic self-sufficiency. And then these war heroes, Andrew Jackson, William Henry Harrison, they're these new generation of political leaders, as well as John C. Calhoun and Henry Clay. They're going to be around for a while. And it brings in this new era of nationalism, like America and patriotism. It's not nationalism like what we think of today with like white nationalism, and we'll talk a little bit about that. Nationalism at this point in time is a very patriotic feeling, okay? And so that is the end of the Jeffersonian, the Age of Jefferson. And in the next lecture, we will talk about the Era of Good Feelings and the common man and kind of democratization. So I hope you learned something today, and I'll see you next time.